So you had a 2-day break thanks to my internet connection playing truant.
Good morning, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, good morning. Um, I guess you deserved that break, especially given the fact that what is coming today is akin to, so I can say something like what Churchill said when England was going to the Second World War. He said, I promise you blood, toil, and tears. Well, there's no blood, but toil and tears, yes. Today you're going to see them. You're going to have toil and tears because since I had this 2-day gap, I was wondering how I could browbeat Louis Althusser, but I found no way of browbeating Louis Althusser when discussing the concept of ideology. And if you have to talk about Louis Althusser, first God bless me, then God bless you. Because Louis Althusser is one of the most opaque writers you can find in the history of all writing. He was considered a madman. He probably was. He murdered his wife and went to jail. So, but he's an extremely, extremely difficult person to understand. But you have to know him if you want to get a clear picture of what ideology is and why you should not use ideologies in the plural in when you're talking about this in the context of what do you say when we talk about in the context of social sciences and when we also examine this political ideologies kind of a thing, even that construct is something that needs to be interrogated. It just cannot be taken because I'm extremely sorry to say that the person or the persons who were in charge of preparing the syllabus had no clue as to what they were doing. So that lands people like me, and because you're my students, it lands us all in very big trouble. I suggest you do one thing. If you have friends in the other colleges, well, first of all, I don't think anybody else will be offering this paper. But if at all it is being offered, just find out how it is being taught. That would be an interesting comparison. Anyway, so let's get going. I think there are enough of you. Yeah, seven. Seven for me is a huge mass of people. Okay, so let's start with the concept of when we're doing this. Please remember we were talking about uh, Karl Marx and his uh, conception of ideology as something which is the opposite of scientific thinking and explanation. So he sees it as something which is used uh, as an explanation by taking recourse to supernatural categories because you don't have a scientific rational explanation for some social problems and issues. We had discussed, for example, okay, he says poverty has been explained in many ways, all of which he says are ideological. And what are ideological explanations? Ideological explanations are those which are unsustainable rationally, first and foremost. Okay, they are not something that can withstand the scrutiny of rationalities. Rationality, sorry. So that is what he means by ideology. And once he used ideology in this particular way, and even before him, you do find other people having used ideology in this particular manner. Uh, you find ideology being used by, uh, what's his name? Rousseau, to a certain extent. Hegel also uses ideology. very similarly, and not exactly the same thing. Okay, Hegel calls it positivity. Okay, positivity, just because there is
Sir,
positive. Yes, sir.
can we say ideology as a perspective? Is it similar to perspective?
No, it isn't. A perspective should be justifiable. Ideology is something that you cannot justify. That is exactly what even Hegel says. Hegel doesn't call it the same things that uh, Marx calls, but remember that Marx was at one time a young Hegelian. He was a part of the young Hegelian movement in Germany. So you see that there are influences of Hegel on Marx, and Marx is somebody who, Hegel is somebody who says, you know, um, ideology is following rules without knowing why you're following them, which for him is actually a positivity. And he says the laws are also positive laws when you don't understand them. So, positive law, positivity, they have to be understood in Hegel as a dead objectivity. Okay, dead objectivity meaning that there is no more objectivity there. All right, people are just unquestioningly, this will come up again, so I'm not going to dwell on it. It'll come up in today's class again, so I'm not going to dwell on it at great length now. Uh, Dead objectivity is when you follow laws without understanding them, without questioning them, and even if you question them, you are discouraged. You are completely discouraged from asking questions, right? So that becomes positivity. So positivity is not a good thing in Hegel. Okay, uh, but that's a different issue. We'll talk about it in a bit. I told you the other day the whole karmic theory. I'm not going to refer to that again. The karmic theory tells you that you've had, the sum total of your bad deeds exceed the sum total of your good deeds. And therefore, while you have had enough good deeds to give you a human birth, uh, there is, you haven't done enough good to get a, you know, problem free or relatively problem free human birth, and therefore you are born poor. That is how you explain poverty in the karmic theory, karma. That for Marx would be a proper ideological explanation. Doesn't explain anything, he'll say the whole idea of birth, rebirth. How can you establish all this rationally? Okay, that is what he would say. And so his investigation is something that goes into the realm of what he called the scientific. And I'm not going to go into this full explanation again. I told you that he had this base superstructure model in which the base was constituted by the economy. So it is the economic base, which is the foundation, the one that is hidden from our view. And what you see above the ground is the superstructure, which is the legal political superstructure. So he says that we only concentrate on the legal political superstructure. And because we concentrate on the legal political superstructure and don't understand the economic base that is actually determining the uh, legal political superstructure, we tend to come up with explanations which are unsustainable. And these are what he calls ideological explanations. That's what he would call. And he basically gave to go, let me, I had given you this example while talking about the economic base and while talking about the legal political superstructure. I had told you, and I hope you remember, that he believes that uh, this is unscientific thinking, ideological thinking, and he had a great deal of faith in science, so much so that Habermas calls him uh, a subscriber to scientism. I'll explain that term later. And he also had a great the biggest influence on him from the natural sciences is Charles Darwin. Okay, and he believed that as opposed to creationism, which you find in Christianity, which says God created so and so on the first day, and God created something else on the second day, and God created something else on the third day, and on the seventh day he took rest. And so that is the day of the Sabbath. And I'll tell you, I don't know if I told you the story of the Sabbath, but I'll tell you that story another time. Uh, now, so it is all that is called creationism. And I, since I'm a mad Kawasaki fan, uh, I picked up a sticker when I was a very young fellow, and that sticker is still there on my bookshelf, stuck, which says, "On the eighth day, God created Kawasaki." Okay, so I'm a complete fanatic when it comes to Kawasaki, one of those inexplicable things, unscientifically or scientifically. Anyway, so now what Marx is trying to argue is that he has been able to penetrate the base. He has been able to go down to the base, understand the economic processes that take place there and how they determine the uh, things that happen in the legal political superstructure. I had told you, and I hope you remember, that he has been accused of determinism of the economic variety. There are some people who support him, but I'm not going to go into the complexities of all that right now. But what you have to remember is Marx's reluctance to use the word or term society. He says it doesn't explain much and it can be quite misleading. He says when we talk about society, we talk about a solidarity between people in the society. If there isn't a proper solidarity uh, among people, then he says that is not a society at all. So he says what we have, and I'm really sorry I'm going to load you with all this stuff. That's why I said this should have been in the third semester. He talks about capitalist mode of production, doesn't talk about it as society. He talks about what came before that as the feudal mode of production. And he talks about what came or what existed before the feudal mode of production as the primitive mode of production. And for him, what constitutes, as opposed to, say, Aristotle, he says it is an instinct, Aristotle, that is, he says it is an instinct of the human being to be social. Man is a social animal. Okay. Marx wouldn't agree with that completely. He would say, why are we a social animal? You have to answer that as well. Why should we call ourselves social animals? He says people come together because of the fact that for their survival, they have to labor together. So, in the primitive society, which is the first phase of which is the hunter gatherer, people went hunting and gathering in groups, and that is how they constituted laboring together. And because they went out in groups and they had to hunt animals often which were bigger than them, it couldn't be done by one person. So he says that laboring together is what brought people together. That's why they didn't live in isolation. Okay. And nomadic agriculture, which is the other phase, uh, again required people to work together. One person couldn't till a piece of land, one person couldn't grow any kind of crop. It needed an entire group of people to work together. But he says that the primitive mode of production is something which is relatively equalitarian because of the fact that there is no privileging of one kind of activity over another. Okay, there is no privileging of one kind of activity over another, and there is no social hierarchy, therefore. So, to put it very quickly, a mode of production has two components. The first one is what he calls, okay, let me type mode of production first. Okay, this is what he says. A mode of production has two components. The first one is the forces of production. What are the forces of production? The forces of production are the technology that is available to you for production and how people are involved in the production process. Production of what? Production of social wealth. And that can be grains, that can be food by hunting animals. All that comes under mode of production. And forces of production are how you do this. Now, in a primitive society, what you find is that the forces of production are rarely hierarchical. Rarely hierarchical. Why? Because the technology, the tools that are available are primitive. Okay. And people had to use those primitive tools. So there was no way in which some people could say that I am doing something that you are not doing. Since the forces of production are equalitarian, he says the relations of production, sorry, are also equalitarian. Now, please understand the relations of production are determined by forces of production. If in the forces of production there is no hierarchy, then in the relations of production there is no hierarchy. Okay? Then in the relations of production there is no hierarchy. It is something which is simply called mode of production, which is equalitarian. Okay?
Uh, Sir, I didn't follow this.
Okay? Let's put it this way. Uh, you have to produce food to eat. In primitive societies, you did it in two ways, which is hunting, gathering, gathering of, even today the Adivasis in India who live in forests, they gather honey, okay, they gather fruit. So people are dependent on the forest. So that is gathering, hunting an animal for food. One person doesn't go and do it and doesn't say, I killed it, so this is mine. He doesn't, okay, because it's a group activity. People go in groups, kill an animal in groups, gather things in groups. So the forces of production, everybody is doing the same kind of work. There is absolutely no hierarchy that this work is superior. What I am doing is superior to what you are doing. Same thing with agriculture. Same thing with agriculture. He would say everybody takes part in doing agriculture, in nomadic agriculture, till a piece of ground has its fertility. The nomadic group would be there, they would grow their crop, whatever that may be, and they would do it as a group activity. Everybody takes part in that. So there is no hierarchy there. There's nobody saying, you do this, you do that, okay, while the others are doing it. No, everybody does this. So the forces of production are the ones that result in the produce. Let's put it that way. And if they are equalitarian or egalitarian, then the relations of production, which is the relations that you have between two people, okay, the relations that you have between two people, those are also equalitarian. Nobody is held superior and nobody is considered superior. Let me jump a bit. I wanted to give this example a little later, but let me jump a bit and give you this example so it'll help you understand things better. Uh, the day my dad died, my dad was the patriarch of. When I say patriarch, I don't mean he was a patriarchal person. What I mean is, in our family, he had cousins and all. He was the eldest. So the entire family, when we gave the news that he had passed away, they came in. So they were all sitting. There was nothing much to do. We were just waiting so that we could take him and give him to the Usmania Medical College. So while people were waiting, um, my driver, he also decided to come and wait upstairs, and he sat in a chair. He sat in a chair. Now, most of the people didn't know who he was, and but my wife was a little surprised. She said, "What is he doing here? Why is he sitting here along with the relatives? Why is he sitting in this chair?" And I was a little taken aback. I said, "This is not the time to talk about all that." But you see, that is the forces of production affecting the relations of production. He is my driver. He drives. I sit in the back seat. I pay him a salary. I pay him a salary. Okay. And he, therefore, is not my equal. So, when it comes to relations, let's call them, for a moment, for your clarity, let's call them social relations. He is not my equal. So he can't sit in a chair. He can't sit in a place where all my relatives are there. That is what my wife is holding in her mind. What is there in his mind is that he is a Hafiz. I don't know if you know what that term means. Hafiz, but pronounced Hafiz. A Hafiz is a scholar of the Quran. He's a scholar of the Quran. He knows the Quran by heart. He knows the Quran by heart. He can also be a Maulana who leads the Friday prayers in a mosque. So he sees himself as an educated person. That is why he used to sit there. And I've never encouraged people sitting on the floor anyway. Whoever it is, if they come to meet me, they sit in a chair. Whoever it is. That is my philosophy. So he sat there. I said, forget about all that now. So this is relations of production. Because he is my driver, he is somebody who is not equal in social relations as well. So let me put this in a better example. If there is somebody who is an attender of mine in the college, now his being an attender and my being a professor, you must understand, is confined only to the college. It is confined only to the college. Okay? He's an attender as long as he's in the college. I am a professor as long as I am in the college. Whoever is the head of the department is head of the department only in the college. Once the college gives over and we are no longer in the atmosphere of the college, then we are equals, ideally. He's a human being, I'm a human being. His rank and his stature are only confined to the college. So if I run into him elsewhere, let's say I run into him uh, in a film theater, okay, he's under no obligation to come and say, Namaste, sir, to me. He's under no obligation to say that. So, but is that how it is? No. We expect people who are lower than us in the hierarchy at our place of work. We expect them to continue to remain low in every sphere of life and in every aspect of life. They are lower than us. That is how it is. So those are the relations of production. Call them social relations just for a minute so that you get an understanding of what that means. So what Marx is saying is that the forces of production determine the nature of, or rather, the nature of the forces of production determine the nature of the relations of production. If the forces of production are egalitarian, where there is nobody superior, nobody inferior, then the relations of production are also equalitarian. So, if you say society, Marx will think that society shows a solidarity which is of an equal variety. But he says that is not so. What you do as work and in the production process determines the rest of your relations anywhere and everywhere. 1 second, please. Okay, so when why the transition takes place, I will tell you when I do Marx, not now. The transition, when it takes place from primitive to feudal mode of production, you have people who have used the principle of might, and they have occupied lands. Okay, the primary form of private property is land. So, what Marx is saying is that people occupy lands and declare that this is my land. They round up cattle and declare that these cattle are mine. Okay, I think you should read a novel set in the Wild West of America in the 19th century. You should read any novel by Louis L'Amour, L-O-U-S, Louis Le, let me put it here in this corner. You should read his novels. There are very, very authentic descriptions. See, when the United States of America formed, it formed only on the East Coast, 13 states only. Okay, and that was called New England. And so people were encouraged to go into the West, okay, occupy more territories. So in the West, when people were going, occupying territories, they were setting up towns. Okay, they were setting up towns there. And while setting up towns, they would occupy a piece of land. And then people started, the more powerful among them, started occupying their own private properties and started calling them ranches, R-A-N-C-H. They would round up cattle, and to make sure that people knew that it was their cattle, that that cattle belonged to them. What they would do is they would use a branding iron. Have you heard of it before? Hmm? Anyone?
No.
No? Well, a branding iron would be let's say, Padma Navanand is the ranch owner, okay? And she has several cow punchers, as they were called, who is working under her. And she has managed to round up cattle that didn't belong to anyone. And she decided that she'll kind of make them her own cattle, but so that nobody else takes it away.
By marking, sir.
Yes. So you create PN on an iron. Okay. On an iron, you mark PN standing for Padmanavanand, and you heat the iron and apply that iron onto the back of the cattle. Okay. So that is called branding. Branding is mine, saying something is mine. Today, the word brand has reached Nike is a brand, Adidas is a brand, Reebok is a brand. Why am I talking about footwear? Must be my wife's influence. Anyway, so these are all brands. So a brand stands for, at one time, it only stood for the idea that it belongs to someone, something, an animal usually. But now it is brand recall. How many people are familiar with the brand? Is Lenovo a favorable brand? How many people look at Lenovo? How many people look at Dell? Okay, those kind of things are now brands. Just like from a market yard, we have graduated to the idea of marketing. You market a brand, you build a brand so that people remember, and people will say, give an identity to the brand. And so in advertising, when people advertise Woodland shoes, they put a baseline that describes what Woodland shoes are. It said, made out of leather that weathers. Okay, that means they're long lasting. So that's what you want people to remember Woodland shoes as. Okay, they last. So that's how you have to remember. So once Padma has become a ranch owner, has her own cattle, has employees below under her. Now, are her employees her equals? They are not her equals. Now the forces of production have changed. Now the forces of production have changed. There are hierarchies. There are hierarchies even among landowners. Not all landowners are equally powerful. People with larger land holdings are more powerful than those who have smaller land holdings. So the forces of production have now become inegalitarian, or they have become inequalitarian. So there are superiors, there are bosses, and there are workers. So what happens with that? That reflects in the relations of production. Your servant is a servant anywhere. So strictly speaking, if my maid is coming here and working, she's a maid as long as she's working here. Once we are out on the road, she's my equal. She's a human being. I'm a human being. I'm going through in great detail because in the life world of Habermas, this is exactly what we will be discussing. Habermas talks about two kinds of reason. He says instrumental reason and emancipatory reason. Okay, so we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so when the forces of production become unequal, when there is a boss, when there is a hierarchy, then the relations of production are also hierarchical. A boss who should be a boss only in the context of work also becomes the boss in the rest of society. Wherever you meet, your boss is your boss. That's it. So, Marx says if the forces of production have hierarchy, then that affects the nature of the relations of production, which also now become hierarchical. He says the term society doesn't explain this, and therefore he sticks to mode of production. So in the feudal mode of production, you have that entire hierarchy. Okay, in India, zamindar, then you had uh, subedar, yeah, mansabdar, then you had jagirdar. In Europe, you had just the lord, you had over him a baron, then an earl, and a duke. Okay, so feudalism creates a hierarchy even among the landholders. So first, their nature of relations, a duke will not consider an earl as his equal. An earl will not consider a baron as his equal. And none of these will consider those who work for them to be their equals. So these people have private property on which other people are working, and therefore the relations of production also become inequalitarian. They become absolutely unequals, even in relations. Have you got this point now, madam?
Yes, sir. It is clear.
Okay. Somebody wanted to say something?
Sir, according to dialectic, thesis and antithesis, we get synthesis now, sir. In primitive society, uh, how force of production.
Madam, were you not there in day before? The last class I took, I told you that is not the dialectic. Hmm? Thesis, antithesis,
Okay.
synthesis. That is what Johann Fichte said, and that is not the dialectic. The dialectic is very different. I'll explain that to you. Time will come in this course only, very shortly, when I'll explain that to you again. Okay?
Okay, sir. Okay.
Till then, hold on. Okay, so Marx calls it historical materialism. He doesn't call it dialectical materialism. If you read any of Marx's books, you will not find a single place where he uses the idea of dialectical materialism. Marx only uses historical materialism. Okay, and that is completely different from dialectical materialism. In fact, dialectical materialism is an Engelsian phrase which Lenin conflated into this body of thought that he wanted to create, one unified body of thought. So he put Lenin, he put himself, Engels, he put himself in it. He put all people and said, this is Marxism. Actually, a lot of Engels will go against Marx instead, in spite of both of them having worked together on things like the critique of the Gotha program and all that. Despite all that, you will find that they actually, if you bring Engelsian thinking into Marx, then Marx gets into a lot of problems. Anyway, I'll I'll get back to that. I remember that you have asked this question. Check back on the lesson. I don't know which day was it, Thursday, right? Whatever date that is, check back. I have explained that whole. Uh, it's there on YouTube. Okay. Check back where I told you that it's not antithesis. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Anyway, so in the capitalist mode of production, the forces of production have again changed. Now there is greater technology, there is greater scientific thinking, and therefore, what do you find? You find that there are people who become investors, people who started as mercantilists or merchants, built up capital and invested it in, in the industries that came up as a result of the Industrial Revolution. I will describe the Industrial Revolution in detail in my evening class. Okay, if you attend those classes, I shall tell you step by step what happened in the Industrial Revolution and how the Renaissance that happened in Italy and the Protestant ethic that happened, the Protestant movement that started in Germany and generated the Protestant ethic there, led to industrial revolution of all places in England. So I'll tell you that story in detail and how the Industrial Revolution also took place. Okay, so if you come in the evenings, you will know those stories. I see myself as a storyteller, basically. That doesn't mean that I'm telling you fiction. I try to put things in a context and I try to explain how those contexts arose. It's not enough to put things in a context. Okay, you also have to try and understand how the context arose. So that's what I'll be doing more in the evenings, the minor details, because here I am constrained for time. So when you come to the capitalist mode of production, you find the capitalist suddenly is the one who is in control of the means of production. What are the means of production? The technologies, money. You require all these things in order to have proper production. So technologies, industries, science, all these are controlled. Today you have this whole thing called intellectual property rights. So you're also talking about intellectual property. Why should an idea be somebody's property? Seriously. Why should it be? Ideas should not be anybody's property. But we have made it that way. Okay. And so when we look at the capitalist mode of production, it is the worker versus the capitalist, or the bourgeois versus the proletariat, as Marx puts it. And what are the forces of production? The capitalist invests in the means of production and provides an opportunity of employment to the laborer, the worker, and therefore he superior to considers himself superior to the rest of the people. Akshay, if you're lying down and listen, you'll fall asleep. My voice is like that. It puts people to sleep, I'm told. So Akshay must have fallen asleep by now. Yeah. So it's okay. I'm only joking. You can lie down and listen. No problem. Not a problem, Akshay. I just like to make these stupid jokes. You know I'm a stupid fellow, right? No problem. Have your privacy. As long as you're listening, it doesn't matter. Just thought I'll break the monotony of what I'm doing. Yeah. So I encourage people to eat in my class also. Drink non-alcoholic beverages, even in physical classes, because at least that'll keep them from falling asleep. So, yeah. So in the capitalist mode of production, it is the capitalist who is providing the means of production. He's providing the means of production to the laborers to work on. And if they are going to be working on the capital, on the forces of on the means that have been provided to them to work on, and are getting a wage in return for that, then it means that the capitalist is superior to the worker. And therefore, that also gets reflected in the relations of production. The capitalist will not consider the worker as his equivalent. He will not consider as his equivalent. Why? Because I pay him a wage. I pay him a wage. How can he be my equal? Okay. So at one time, people wanted government jobs because of the fact that then you're not working for a master. But nowadays, as economies have developed, uh, people prefer working in the private sector because that is where there is more money. So it doesn't matter if you're working for, but corporations are no longer headed by individuals, but still the hierarchy exists. A director is higher than anyone else. Below him, below a supervisor, then you have a chief operations officer, you have a chief executive officer, you have a chief technology officer, you have a chief financial officers, all of whom report to the what should I say? All of whom report to the managing director and the chairman. Okay, so in that sense, uh, the hierarchy persists. The hierarchy persists. Okay, so that is seen again in the relationship of production. It is seen, it is reflected in the relations of production. According to Marx, that's the caveat. Because when I go to Habermas, Habermas tries to disprove both the base and legal superstructure model, base superstructure model, and the idea of the mode of production and the contingent relationship that exists between forces of production and relations of production. He says Marx has determinism in two places where the base is supposed to be determining the superstructure, but it is not always the case. He gives counter instances and he says that forces of production leading to a certain kind of relations of production is not a necessary thing. It is something that might have happened due to various other reasons, which I'll cite later on. So if I'm clear about that, I would like to move on. So what Marx is basically trying to tell you is that by unearthing this whole idea of how he also introduces this element, which you must have done, especially if you did uh, economics at your undergraduate level. Surplus value. Anybody who has done surplus value? Who knows what it is?
Yes, sir.
What is surplus value, madam? Madam Garu.
Profits. Profits.
Profit is surplus value? No. It is through surplus value that you have the thing of profit. Surplus value is your generating money in order to make a profit. So he gives you an entire theory where he says, again, I don't know if I should go into it now. Maybe I'll go into it now. Marx talks about, let's talk about surplus value in the capitalist times. Okay. Now, what Marx says is there are two kinds of capital. One is constant capital and two is variable capital. Okay. So what is constant capital? Constant capital is money and machinery. Variable capital, oh, wage labor. Okay. So we have these two kinds of capital. Constant capital is money and machinery. Why is he calling it constant? Let me give you an example. Take a 500 rupee note. Okay. Take this 500 rupee note, put it in in an almirah in your house, lock it away, and come back after 1 year, open that almirah, and you take out the note. How much will it be? It'll be 500
The
rupees.
same 500.
Yes. Similarly, let's say you have a very simple example. You have a sewing machine, which you buy and put it in one corner. Does it do anything? Does it generate
No.
money? It doesn't, right? So that's why they're constant. They are unchanging. But if you invest that money, go and put it in a fixed deposit for 1 year, then that money multiplies in a bank. How? Because what the bank is doing when it is asking you to put it in a fixed deposit for a certain period of time, what it is asking you to do is to invest your money in the bank, which will give a loan to someone else. So if you are getting a 6.5% loan in a fixed deposit, then the same money is given to somebody who wants to run a venture, a business. It is given to him at a rate of 9.5%. So bank also makes money. You also get a 6.5% interest on your money. That's why it basically increases in value, because it is being given away to someone as loan, so that you don't ask for that money back. The bank will make it a term deposit. You can't pull out a loan, a fixed deposit before the term elapses. Even if you buy mutual funds have a lock-in period. Okay, 7 years or 5 years. There is a period called the lock-in period, during which time you have to forget that you have invested a certain amount of money with a mutual fund. Okay, why? Because at the time that you are in the lock-in period, that money is circulating elsewhere. And if you are unlucky, that's why they put that disclaimer. Okay, mutual funds are subject to market risks. Read the thing carefully. We don't read. Okay, so you can invest something and actually lose money if the market is not performing properly. Like a pandemic like this can lead to a reduction in the value of what you have invested. So you see, all these things are because of the fact that there is circulation. But on their own, they can't multiply. So wage labor is what generates surplus value as far as Marx is concerned. Wage labor generates surplus value. Ultimately, to the guy who took the loan from the bank to set up an industry or whatever, how is he making his profit to pay the bank loan back? He is manipulating wage labor. How does the manipulation of wage labor happen? Mm. He would say through surplus labor time. What does surplus labor time mean? Surplus labor time okay? Surplus labor time is the time that a worker is working and being productive. He's being productive, but he is not being paid for it. Now, for example, a working day is supposed to have 8, bless you, Gesundheit. Right. So, surplus labor time is the worker producing something but not being paid. The average working time, not the average, the set working time for work is supposed to be 8 hours a day. That's what is supposed to be working, 8 hours a day. And if you have done work for 8 hours a day, you produce a certain amount for which you have to be paid, but you won't be paid work a wage that is commensurate, okay, that is commensurate with the time that you put in. You may be paid a little less, but very often you're made to work for 16 hours, 14 hours, 12 hours. And on those days, when basically people, the worker, those times, sorry, that the worker is working beyond the 8-hour limit, he's still being productive. But instead of his being paid overtime, nowadays it is there, I'm talking about Marxian times, instead of paying overtime, he is not paid money at all. Marx was moved by the plight of coal miners who went into coal miners for 2-3 days at a time and were paid a pittance. Pittance. I want you to, if possible, read a novel. Okay, it's called The Germinal, Germinal, Germinal by Emile, Emile, Emile Zola, Zola, Germinal. He gives you a wonderful description of the plight of the working class. What kind of filth and squalor they lived at one particular time. Gives you very, very elaborate description. You must read that book. It'll give you a very good idea of. And I think, how many of you have done public administration? Nobody has done.
Sir, I have done.
Did you do the scientific management theory? Taylorism? F.W. Taylor?
Yes, sir.
You did that?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So then I request you to kindly see this film by Charlie Chaplin. Everybody thinks Charlie
Right.
Chaplin. Huh? You were saying something?
Yes, sir. Tell me. No,
Yeah.
no.
Charlie Chaplin, people think, was a comedian. People think he was somebody um who just made silly films. Behind what looked like a very silly film is a huge, huge philosophy. I would like you to watch two of his films. One film, Modern Times, which is a his take on Taylorism and Frederick Taylor. How Taylor wanted to maximize production, minimize wastage of time. So he actually devised 8 kinds of movement along the assembly line, which would maximize the production time and increase profits. He lampoons this in Modern Times. You should see that movie, all of you. And Charles Chaplin was a very serious person, actually. He said once, and I don't know, it hit me very badly. He once said, I walk in the rain. No, he said, I like walking in the rain because it disguises the fact that I'm crying. He said that. He was a very serious person,
Yes, sir.
a very big philosopher. And the other movie that I want you to teach that I talked to you about, Hitler, the other day. He did a movie on Hitler while Hitler was alive, the great dictator. Please see those movies. See any Charlie Chaplin movie if you can. City Lights is another one. The caprice of the rich, how they treat the poor. So you can see City Lights. Great films, all of these. Amazing man, Charlie Chaplin. One of my, and Raj Kapoor invented the tramp role in Bollywood films by going through Charlie Chaplin. Okay, so let me get back to surplus labor time. The surplus labor time is if you're paid for 8 hours, when you have worked for 12 hours, then you have to be paid overtime, but you're not paid overtime. So what happens? What happens is that the money that should go to the worker is appropriated for himself by the capitalist. And by taking away that money, which should have been which should have been paid for, what he is basically doing is that he's enriching himself at the expense of the wage laborer. That is what is happening. He's enriching himself at the expense of the wage laborer. So surplus labor time means the time that you have been productive but you have not been paid. It is through this When I teach you Marx, I'll teach, if I am still alive then, who knows? That's next semester. It is through this that surplus value is generated. Surplus value the capitalist gets and keeps for himself because of the fact that he doesn't pay the laborer for all the time that he has worked. So surplus value is generated through surplus labor time, and that is how profit margins are maintained. That is how profit margins are maintained. Okay, so variable capital. Why is it variable? Because you can manipulate it. You can manipulate it. Now, I've been contacted by I have been contacted by a new university that's coming up, and they want top-notch faculty. Okay, they want to make sure that this university will be known for its faculty. And how much do they want to pay? Assistant professor, 30,000. Seriously? University paying 30,000? And they want top-notch faculty. So that's how they generate surplus value. Because there are so many people out there who will say, first let me get this job. The opportunity has opened up. Let me get this job. Once I'm in this job, then I'll have experience. And then I can move to another university at a higher rate. So that is how private universities are also capitalist. And they'll make you work from the morning to evening, and they'll pay you 30,000. When you should be paid at least 70. So 40,000 per month per faculty. They are basically ensuring that they are taking away. You know, even these wonderful names, Jindal University, Ashoka University, Flame, Kriya, they don't pay. They don't pay. You can consider yourself very lucky if you get a lakh. But to do an MA public policy course in Jindal University, you have to pay a fee of 6.5 lakhs. So you see, this is, if I have to use a phrase from my favorite poet, lyricist, singer, musician, Roger Waters, it's all about money, honey. That's what he sang in one of his songs. Okay, so this is the way in which surplus value is generated, and that converts into profit. Now, this according to Marx, is all these things that he has done is the so that's what he says. People only saw the superstructure and therefore they didn't get. So that's why they took recourse to ideological explanations. So he says his scientific analysis is something that led to his overcoming ideology and telling the story of inequality and the perpetuation of poverty. Obviously, not everyone agrees with him, but even within the Marxist school, you have the critical theory school, one of which is, one of which is the Frankfurt School, and you have Habermas debunking many of these. I'll do that when we go to the life world system. But tomorrow when I meet you, I had promised you blood, toil, and tears. That didn't happen, did it? But it did, because how many are there? Gradually it's been dwindling. Oh, 7 are still there. That's a very big number. For me, 7 is houseful. I'm used to teaching 1, 2 people. Louis Althusser, who's a structural Marxist, primarily a structuralist, with some sympathy for the concerns of Marx. He says that due to the language that we use on an everyday basis, due to the structure of that language, especially the syntax, he says the syntax restricts how much experimentation can be done with a language. So he comes up with this particular idea that due to structural limitations of language, you cannot overcome ideology. And he says Marx was under an illusion that he had overcome ideology. He hadn't overcome ideology. He says ideology persists and will continue to persist. So that is the real toil and tears part. So see you tomorrow. Any questions on what I said today?
Sir, why should an ideology be scientific?
Ideology is not scientific. It's the opposite of science as far as Marx is concerned. It's the opposite. You take recourse to ideology because you don't have the scientific, you have not had a scientific exploration of how poverty was created in the first place. How did we move from an relatively equalitarian society in primitive times to this particular uh, situation where first in feudalism you had poverty that led to the demise of feudalism. But as Rousseau pointed out, John Locke said, capitalism is the solution to poverty. And don't think he's an idiot, huh? Please. How can capitalism be? For us, it mightn't be. But you have to look at him in his own context. He said capitalism is the solution to poverty. And Rousseau, who came after Locke, a few years after Locke, he could see what Locke didn't see, which he called the paradox of capitalism, which is the paradox of poverty amidst plenty. Till capitalism, if there was impoverishment, then everybody got impoverished. Okay, then everybody got impoverished. But in capitalism, Rousseau said, there's plenty, but there's also poverty. So one fine example of that is the 24-storied home of Mukesh Ambani. If you go and stand in it, you can see the world's biggest slum, Dharavi. You can see Dharavi. So it's a coexistence of plenty and poverty. So that is a paradox. And Rousseau identified the paradox but didn't have an answer as to why it happened. Or so Marx says. And so he says, I am going to give you that answer. I am going to give you that answer of how the paradox of poverty amidst plenty happens. And that is because of classes and one class exploiting another. That is his answer. So he said, I've overcome ideology. Louis Althusser said, sorry, that's what he thought. But he didn't. He didn't overcome ideology at all. That's what he says. And it cannot be overcome. Not only does he say that he didn't overcome ideology, he says it cannot be overcome at all. Have I answered your question?
So, Sir, Marx viewed ideology only from this perspective of capitalism, poverty. What was
No,
his
no,
generic
no.
view of an ideology?
The generic view of the ideology is, like I said here, which is the opposite of scientific thinking and explanation. It is the opposite of that. Okay, like the
So
karmic
he says it
theory.
should be scientific.
If you have scientific thought, then you won't have ideology.
Okay.
He says ideology shouldn't exist. The existence of ideology basically means that you don't have a scientific explanation of social processes. So if you need to show, if you find an answer for social processes scientifically, then there's no necessity for ideology. So for him, ideology is not something that should exist at all. It should stop existing.
So all the ideologies which are existing, they are
He
not
will, he
scientific,
will,
and since
he
they are
will, yeah, exactly. For him, there is no all ideologies. There are different forms of ideological explanations. But the concept of ideology is this: an unscientific, unsubstantiated explanation.
okay.
Okay, you can have
So, for
many.
example, sir,
Yeah, go ahead.
democracy, as you said, the other democracy, if it is an ideology,
It's
so
not
it
an
is not
ideology.
scientific.
It's not an ideology for Marx. Marx will say democracy is an end that we need to pursue. Okay,
Okay.
it is a goal that we need to pursue. It's not an ideology. And he says that you can never have proper democracy from within the premises of liberalism. So he says liberal democracy is a contradiction in terms. And he says the only way in which you can have proper democracy is if you usher in communism. So we tend to think communism, because this will be a products of Cold War, people like us, and we have passed on that knowledge unquestioningly to younger people like you. Okay. Uh, During the Cold War, it was shown as socialism versus democracy, communism, which is a dictatorship, versus democracy, which was freedom. They never use the word capitalism. Huh? They use democracy as a surrogate term for capitalism. They never use the term capitalism. So communism became dictatorship thanks to Stalin, right? And the Russians, I mean the Soviets then, they were stupid fellows. They were so open in their propaganda as opposed to the Americans. Please believe me, the country in the world that does the highest amount of propaganda is America. And it does through very, very subtle means. It does it so subtly that we don't even realize that we are being manipulated. We don't realize that. That is how America is still continuing to be what it is. Otherwise, I don't know if you know this, it's one of the poorest economies in the world. But yet they have the most money. I'll explain that some other day. Any more?
No, thank you.
Okay. So thank you. Tomorrow I'll try and do Louis Althusser without too much of pain. But some bit of pain I think is unavoidable. So thank you very much
No
for coming.
pain, no gain.
No pain, no gain. Okay. That's a
Thank you,
good
sir.
slogan.
Thank you,
Yeah.
sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.